little bit of a mashup of like the genealogy of morals and the archaeology of knowledge, which is a book Foucault wrote. So
the
archaeology as
yeah,
genealogy,
it's mashup,
or
right?
You know, geology of morals. Anyways, so
philosopher as DJ.
once history becomes one of the most important questions for philosophy, for the creator of concepts, and you're able to trace genealogies. You know, Nietzsche's like, where does, you know, like, where did these Judeo-Christian values come from? Like, let's trace their genealogy. And Foucault can trace the genealogy of, like, well, how did madness, like, get its present signification? How did criminality? How did sexuality? Like, what they all have genealogies, and they're all radically contingent. You know, they don't follow a necessary logical development in a way that Hegel's philosophy showed.
And I can see the painter in the studio rife with this understanding, meaning I'm holding the brush to the canvas. I've got to think of like Caravaggio. I've got to think of Braque. I've got to think of everywhere this has been before I make that mark. And my friend, Young was telling me about an artist, Nicole, who he went to U of C with, and she was in the studio, and she'd just be like shaking, holding the brush in one hand and the Deleuze book in the other hand, and just like the importance of every gesture. And it's almost like I feel like there can be a lot of brevity in that act of historically understanding the relationship of a mark on a canvas to history. And that's where I'm like, is there a way to read Foucault and to read Deleuze without that projected like anxiety? I mean, these are larger things. These are larger.
Of influence.
Nice, yeah. So I don't want artists to be so anxious so that then the art becomes the salve for the anxiety. They create the anxiety, and then the therapeutic aspect of the art has to salve that anxiety.
Yeah, I'm really bored with that sort of.
I'm bored with that relationship.
Artwork as a salve for anxiety.
And then the artist actually creating conditions for the anxiety to come about. Yeah, it's a closed system.
Because no one has yet really, according to what appears to be, no one has yet read Foucault or Deleuze, because that's entirely the first premise of all of their work, is that there's nothing like, for instance, this genealogical method in Foucault that he gets from Nietzsche is about that there's not like one fixed logical development of history, that in fact it's not even that history happens contingently, it's also that the historiographies that we write are radically contingent too. Like his genealogies of sexuality, madness, criminality, etc., like they're not saying that this is like the absolute unchanging objective truth. Like, in fact, it could be much worse than what he wrote, or it could be different. It's like, once you see history as a contingent process, then you have to reckon with, like, it is, like, it is only as, like, accurate as I'm able to write it, or it becomes a question of your own desire. Like, what, how is Foucault going to, like, he could have wrote a much more dystopian genealogy of madness, or much more, utopian. But, like, writing them knowing that, like, the condition of their effectiveness will be how their, like, what circulation they enter into, how they're consumed, how they're distributed, how they're read in a way, and, like, almost, it could be almost the opposite for Hegel. Like, it doesn't, he writes the history, philosophy of history, and he could write actual history, and it wouldn't matter if, anyone read it or not, or if it had any impact on the world or not, because he just became conscious of the truth, of the necessary logical development of history, and that was it. Like, not that it was his goal. Obviously, he was an Enlightenment thinker. His goal was to, spread knowledge and the desire to attain knowledge. Enlightenment would bring freedom, but it wasn't. It wasn't a genealogy. It wasn't. And again, in Deleuze's work, this idea of, like, the anxiety of influence. The anxiety of influence is like is is dealt with, is explicitly solved in every page of Foucault and Deleuze's writing. Like, that is their main. Like, you could say that's the only reason they became philosophers, is to deal with the anxiety of influence. And anyone who's holding one of their books and a paintbrush and shaking hasn't read a word.
I know.
And
I was just thinking that
that's all their
Deleuze
readers. Like,
would be
Deleuze
like,
wrote
"Oh, brother, what are you doing, sister, in your studio?"
First of all, Deleuze wrote an essay in response to a critic, where he talks
Right.
about how the history of philosophy was used to bludgeon philosophy students
Right.
into basically a situation
Submission.
of submission due to the anxiety of influence.
Right.
Like, that you would lose track studying great mind and great work after
Right.
great mind and great work, that, like, you would lose the thread of, like, your own possibilities.
Right.
You would become, a custodian of their tomb. And
Right.
so,
If you've got this idea of knowledge is power, knowledge as power, then think of also how power relations, usurp, modify, translate, change, adapt, transmigrate, transform. Like,
but I know this difference
only
is
anxiety.
the anxiety of influence is more easily brought out in Deleuze's work, because I know it slightly better, and that is
I think knowledge is
that
it's
there's
transformative.
these two levels, and even in his early work, Expressionism in Philosophy, Spinoza, he talks about Spinoza had this very critique of the anxiety of influence. Spinoza, it's not just, Deleuze and Foucault, it's not just Nietzsche, it's not just Spinoza, it's probably, even earlier, but Spinoza already formulated, like, the, like, logical and rigorous, like, disproof and demonstration of, like, another way of living besides one submitted to the anxiety of influence. And in his book Expressionism in Philosophy, Deleuze talks about this, like, there's an expressive sort of way of going about things, and then there's, like, a productive way of going about things. And the expressive way is, like, that and is Hegelian. It's like, well, what is always the question, what does this mean, and, like, you can even see these two levels in all his works, but, for instance, Anti-Oedipus, between, like, the meaningless functioning of the desiring machines, and then, like, the meaning and significance, like, machines of, like, this social machines.
Okay, we're going to take a break of social machines and also look at the unexamined life, examined or is not worth or is worth living at all.